Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about how to add a new component in Octant. This is going to be the first video in a series of videos to show in a full stack way how to add a new component in Octant, starting with the backend in Go and then moving on to the front end Angular piece and how to tie it all together, and along with some other tidbits like testing along the way. So let's get started. The component we're interested in adding today is going to be a timeline component, and it happens to be a clarity component. So what we need to do on the Go side is to figure out what attributes of this timeline component needs to be captured within Go, so then we can pass it on to the Angular side and actually render that timeline component. So the first thing we're going to do is go into package, view component, and then we're going to add a new Go file, and we'll just call this timeline.go. And sure, we'll add it to Git. We'll zoom in a little bit here. And we're going to just start with some pretty boilerplate stuff. We're going to do type timeline struct. And this struct is going to have a base, and this base is just a component metadata. It's pretty much in common with all of the components, typically containing stuff like if we look in here with the accessor, the title, and the type of component it is. And we have config, and this is something that's done by convention, where we do a timeline config type, which will contain all the details about this timeline component that we're going to implement in a second. So next we're going to need a type timeline config struct, and we are going to look at a timeline component here. So the first thing that jumps out to us is that it tells us there are going to be two types of layouts, horizontal and vertical. And it looks like in each timeline there are going to be a bunch of these steps, and these steps can have certain states and other various descriptors. So we'll capture those in a moment. But let's get the first one. Let's get the steps. The steps are going to be a slice, because you could have 1, 0, or more of these timeline step. And let's give it a field with JSON steps, and then we can also add vertical. And I think it's reasonable to assume that the default is going to be a horizontal timeline, just simply because of how flex layouts in Octant work. But this video will likely be recorded and published before this code lands in production, so the final product might not look identical to what's shown in the video, but that's quite all right since this is mainly for showing the thought process. Cool. So now we have to define what is a step. So we do type timeline step struct. And within each of the step, we're going to have a state. And what type of states are there? Well, we can look at the API documentation. There are our layouts, horizontal, vertical. And then we have the states. So not started, current, processing, success, and error. So we're going to have all of those. And I think the best way to do it is to do something like a timeline state type, and then we're going to create another type that'll represent all 5 of these possible states. And I'll show what I mean in a moment here. Right, so we could do type timeline state, and it's going to be a string, and then we can just define a bunch of constants that will capture all these types. So timeline step not started, timeline state, and that'll equal to not started. And let's try to see if we can get this a little faster. Timeline step current, timeline step processing, and timeline step success. Step error. And cool. So now we have all of our states. And the next thing we're going to look at is what other metadata is attached to a particular step. And taking a look here, we have like timestamp, that seems to be the header. We have a title and a description. We also have this thing called an action, so it's possible to have a button, one of these things. Actions are also something that's internal to Octant, which is like something that should happen when you click a button and it executes some code somewhere, whether it be a plugin or internally. For now, let's not worry about the action piece. We can come back to that in a different video, or honestly, it's a different feature altogether. So let's focus on the other pieces, right? So we're going to need a header, and it's going to be string JSON header. We're going to need a title. That's also a string JSON title, and description string JSON description. Cool. All right, so now we can actually start thinking about the API. So if I were, say, like a plugin developer, how would I want to do this, right? So the first thing is going to be a new timeline. And remember that base needs a title for the metadata, so we can do something like a title string. Then the next logical thing would probably be a list of steps. Timeline step, and then whether or not it's vertical. And this is going to return our timeline, and return ampersand timeline. Cool. Let's start thinking about the config now. Whoa. Let's do this a step at a time. What's going on here? Config. All right. So the first thing we're going to need to think about is what should go here. And we have a helper method for a lot of these things in creating a new component. A new base really just takes in a component type and a title. We haven't defined the component type yet, so we'll go do that. This is going to be in base.go. And here we see a bunch of the various component types, and we're going to need to create a new one here. So let's do type timeline is a timeline component. Type timeline equals timeline. Cool, now we have our type ready to go, and now it's just going to be type timeline comma title from string as another helper, and this should take the title that we provided as the function parameter. This should not be config, this should be base. Config goes next, and this is our timeline config. Let's use this. Vertical should take on vertical, and steps should take on the steps that we've passed to it. Nice. All right, so now we have the timeline. We want to think about what operations we want to do with our timeline. The first logical one to me is how do we add more steps programmatically? So we're going to do that. Timeline add, and if we add, we're going to think about this and say it makes sense to add more than one step at a time. So maybe something like steps timeline steps, something like that. Then it doesn't need to return anything. And then we can do t.config.steps equals append t.config.steps, and we'll just add the steps. Cool. Something to also think about potentially here is whether or not a race condition is possible from appending into a given timeline. Like you could see scenarios where, I say, even a good example of this would be like the table component, right? You have like a bunch of rows that are whizzing in and out. Yeah, you can kind of see here where we have this lock and unlock for a lot of the add operations, right? Because the table has rows added and taken away all the time. So maybe it's a good practice to do it here as well, where we have a sync.mutex, and we're just going to create a lock as it's appending, and then we're going to unlock it once we're done. That way we can avoid potential race conditions with our add. Cool. And lastly, we're going to need to do the Marshall JSON method. This allows us to take our component that we generated and be able to send it over the wire. So let's do timeline Marshall JSON, and this is going to return byte and error, I believe. Cool. And just like the table, we are going to want to do our lock and unlock right off the bat. All right, so what are we returning? So what we want to do is to take this and make sure that we've added our base, config, and metadata type before we send it over to the Marshall. So we're gonna need to create a new type. Let's say timeline Marshall, or sure, this is going to be a type timeline. And so now we have, let's say, variable m timeline Marshall. Then now it's going to expect a base t dot base, and config is going to be t dot config, comma, and then m dot metadata dot type is going to be type timeline. And now we can return json.marshall. Marshall returns byte and error, so we just need to return our Marshall type, ampersand m, and cool. All right, so this is the first half. Now we got to make sure this actually works as intended. So let's add a new file called timeline_test.go. And we will also add this to Git, and we're going to create a test function for our Marshall. Test timeline Marshall t star testing.t. And we have multiple choices here, so we need to pick the right testing import. All right, cool. So I think we're only going to test one thing here, but we're going to set it up so then as if there could be multiple tests in this single test function, just in case. But let's do our standard boilerplate for tests. So we have our name, we have our input, which is a component, and we're going to have an expected path, which is going to be a string, and is error, and this will just be a catcher for our errors should our Marshall just fail. And then next we're going to have a test case. So let's do a name, and name let's do in general input, and for now let's just do and timeline. You know what? We'll just give it a base for now. So base is going to be new base, type timeline, title from string again, and we'll call this like my timeline. And we're going to verify this later, and we'll take care of config after we get to the second half here. So next is going to be about actually running these tests. And so there's a very well-known pattern for this where it's for test case range tests t.run, and then you can have like tc.name, comma, func t star testing t, and then now you can actually have the test code logic run here. And what we're interested in is json.marshall. We're going to marshal our component, which we defined up here. And let's say we do tc.input, because that's our component. And this returns bytes and error. So we're going to need actual error here. And then we're going to do something interesting. We're going to do is error. And we're going to check if the error is nil. And so if is error does not equal to tc.isError, and here it's not defined, so we don't expect this marshalling to error, so this is false by default. So if it's not false, then we want our test to fail, so we can do unexpected error v, and we'll just show what the error was. If it ends up okay, then we can do something interesting, where similar to a lot of these components, we have a test data file, which has just a bunch of JSON that we can read from file just to make sure it's marshalling correctly. So we're going to use io-util read file, and we're going to need the file path. And this is in the test data directory, and so we also need an expected path here, so we can do expected path, and this is going to be our file name. So let's do timeline.json, and here we can do path.join and do test data, join that with tc.expectedPath, and I believe this is going to return bytes or error, so we're going to do expected error and require that we can actually read from file. And now we do the final check, where we do a little magic assert JSON equal, and this is just a nice little wrapper that shows you the differences in terms of the Go, like the differences between if these don't add up, it shows you like difference between the fields in terms of Go, instead of like just a JSON blob saying like, oh, these strings don't match up. So we can do string expected string actual, and now we have some stuff here, and let's add the new file. This is a timeline.json. Add it, and let's add a dummy JSON file here. Zoom in a little, and we can see if this actually runs. And so yeah, this is kind of cool, because now it's expecting, so like we mentioned earlier, right, like this isn't actually comparing a JSON string, it's actually showing us the map string interface and what we actually want here. So it's a little bit more helpful to debug. And so now we need to populate this timeline and then eventually add stuff over in timeline.json. So let's do that. Config, and this config is going to need to have essentially all of our steps, right? So timeline config, let's fill out all the fields here. And here, vertical, sure, we can leave that as false, and we're interested here in steps. Timeline step, got a bunch of them, and let's create one. And maybe we should take advantage of all of the constants we defined earlier, and just say 5 steps, one for each of these timeline states. So we'll do that. State timeline step success. And then this could be title step 1 header success header description. This is a success. Second one could be state timeline step error. Title step 2 header error header. Then description could be this is an error. The next one is going to be timeline step current. Title step 3 header current header description. This is a current step. And then we can do state timeline step processing step 4 header processing header, description, this is processing, and finally we can do state, timeline, step not started, title, step 5, not started header, and we can do a description here saying this has not started. Cool. So now we have a bunch of stuff here, and we can kind of see like what the output actually might be if we do something like prompt print line, say string actual. So this will take our bytes out of JSON Marshall, and we'll just cast it into a string, and then we can just use that from our console to see what the output is going to be. So let's run this again. We expect it to fail, but we do get a nice little JSON string here that we can copy and paste into. And let's format this. Yeah, so we can see now we have this nice little JSON file that we can read from to confirm this. And now if we run this test again, it's probably going to be correct, and we can take a look at the JSON and verify for correctness. And of course, it'll be more obvious when we work from the front end. But we can take a comparison from, like, say, we look at this Octant component reference, taking a look into our knobs, we can see like it matches up with the general structure, right? So we have metadata type text config, metadata type timeline, and it's got our title and our config. So this is generally correct, and we're going to see later how we're going to use this from the front end side. Anyway, thanks for watching and have a nice day.